Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason. Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be discussing one of America's two original sins. We've already spent a lot of time, of course, on this problematic relationship between Europeans and Native American groups, but today we're going to be diving more deeply into our system of chattel slavery, which is equally unpleasant and provides us with a horrific legacy that we're still grappling with today. Today we're going to be trying to accomplish these objectives, so take a minute and pause and take them in. And let's dive in and talk about chattel slavery. As we talked about previously, the North American colonies were integrated into the system of triangle trade in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, and also as the port cities on the East Coast grew to be important mercantile centers. England provided the manufactured goods, shipped both to Africa and also to the Americas. In Africa, they shipped raw materials back up to England, and the colonies also shipped raw materials to England. And enslaved people were brought from Africa, generally to the Caribbean, as part of the Middle Passage, and then, along with other commodities, sugar, molasses, enslaved people were then also brought up and sold to the North American colonists. The worst part of this whole system, or one of the horrible parts of this system, I should say, because, it's really difficult to choose any worst part of chattel slavery, was the horrificness of the Middle Passage. Equiano here is it provides one of our few primary sources about this, and as he notes, quote, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils that I'd never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me." End quote. Having decided that packing in enslaved people onto these ships provided the greatest return on investment, Europeans put enslaved Africans in unbelievably horrible conditions. Areas where they could barely sit up and where they were chained together below decks led to the death of a substantial percentage of the population of enslaved people. But Europeans, of course, had figured that the enslaved people that survived, it was more cost-effective to pack them in this way and just accept the horrific human toll of the Middle Passage. In the North American colonies, slavery was established in every single colony, even though it was most profitable and the driver of the economic engine in the southern colonies. Most colonies had passed slave codes or some regulation on the behavior of on the actions of enslaved people, and most colonies had established race-based rules about what enslaved people could do and could not do, and what free black people could do and not do. In the southern colonies, slavery, of course, became the major economic driver. In the aftermath specifically of Bacon's Rebellion, the cost of bringing over indentured servants was made plain, and as the colonies moved southward, the institution of slavery came with them, and especially in the growing of cash crops, the use of enslaved people became commonplace. The Carolinas were created separately, with North Carolina being more or less an overflow of backcountry farmers for Virginia. And then eventually the Tidewater region of North Carolina was settled by wealthy planters, as of course the increased value of the land meant that it could only really be profitable for cash crops, and then of course the use of cash crops necessitated the use of enslaved people for labor. South Carolina was originally supposed to be this utopian neo-feudal society, with a fundamental constitution written by John Locke, and there was going to be this tiered nobility and all this fun stuff. But in reality, slave owners from Barbados settled there to farm rice, sugarcane, and then also indigo as a cash crop. And so South Carolina became a slave society, with the vast majority of the population being enslaved people. So that's a huge mess. North Carolina became, again, mostly a miniature Virginia of backcountry farmers, although also, as we said, tobacco plantations began to flourish, especially in the Tidewater region, and you got a series of slave-based societies. Georgia was originally supposed to be a penal colony, and a place to sort of reform people in Europe. And so originally they were going to make very small land grants to individuals and ship over undesirables. And then of course teach them how to live properly and to be sort of shaped into valuable members of society. But it turns out the land in Georgia was also very good for plantation agriculture and cash crops, and so they gave it up, and it became basically a miniature South Carolina, with the downside of Georgia being that there were powerful Native American tribes in the region, which we'll be talking about later, and they prevented much movement into the Georgia backcountry, at least for a few years. And so significant conflict with the local Native American tribes, who were quite powerful and exerted a significant amount of influence over the development of Georgia. As more and more enslaved people were brought over time, some enslaved people were able to either win their freedom or were granted freedom by the people who owned them. And so you started to get a larger black population, growing from the blue numbers, as you can see in 1680, to the red numbers in 1740. Again, it's not a huge percentage of the population, but we're looking at, in places like Massachusetts, several thousand free people of color. These free people of color developed their own culture, developed their own communities, became sometimes, somewhat wealthy landowners, business owners, things like that. Phyllis Wheatley became one of the most famous black poets of the colonial period. She wrote a poem about George Whitehead that we had read in a previous class, and so she's going to become pretty well known. And so you're going to see black communities and black culture and black neighborhoods developing within all of these different colonies. You're also going to see the growth of slave rebellions and maroon communities. We're going to talk about the Stono Rebellion in a minute, but in the areas sort of adjacent to all of these slaveholding societies, you're going to see maroon communities develop. Maroon communities are communities of both formerly enslaved people or runaway enslaved people and Native Americans. They're going to be places in which these groups who are marginalized from the rest of society can develop and build some sort of life in places where other colonial groups were not settling. And so, for example, the Great Dismal Swamp in between Virginia and North Carolina became a large maroon community where enslaved people could escape to and attempt to exert some agency over their life. Florida also became a major hub of a major hub of these maroon communities, both because it's difficult to navigate and also because tension between the English and Spanish colonies led to the Spanish providing havens for escaped enslaved people from the British colonies, despite the fact that slavery was legal within the Spanish Empire. And so it was because Florida was not heavily settled, these formerly enslaved people or runaway enslaved people could integrate into Native American communities and attempt to live life apart from the horrible institution of slavery. The major rebellion of enslaved people was the Stono Rebellion, where a group of enslaved people in South Carolina rose up, were able to free themselves from their master's clutches. They killed a number of plantation owners and attempted to start a larger slave rebellion. Unfortunately, South Carolina was able to put together a militia and put down the Stono Rebellion relatively quickly. And in the end, almost all the enslaved people involved were recaptured and generally killed for their actions. In the aftermath of the Stono Rebellion, Southern slave owners, terrified that their enslaved people would also rise up and follow the example of the enslaved people in the Stono Rebellion, passed a series of slave codes with acts with names like the Negro Act, which put significant restrictions on the lives of enslaved people in an attempt to keep them as downtrodden as possible and to prevent them from communicating and organizing any future rebellions. And so the end result of the Stono Rebellion was much harsher treatment for the enslaved people throughout the southern colonies and a limit on their ability to organize or exert any sort of type of autonomy or freedom. So that's just a brief overview of the development and the development of the institution of slavery within the American colonies. From here, we're going to move forward and discuss the French and Indian War for next time and the results of all of this westward expansion on the geopolitics of various European and Native American powers. Thank you for listening.